At the old estate nestled on the outskirts of town, a black maid discovers that the billionaire she serves is showing signs of post-surgery complications. She speaks up, but no one listens. When he suddenly collapses, she defies everyone and calls for emergency help, only to be mocked by the butler for overreacting. But when the truth comes to light, the woman they overlooked will become the one they can't ignore. Before we dive in, what time are you listening? Where are you from? Drop a comment below and tell me. The Howbridge estate sat behind wrought iron gates and a long gravel drive lined with weathered oaks. From the outside it looked like a piece of history preserved in time, a colonial-style mansion with ivy creeping along stone columns and tall windows reflecting the gray Boston sky. But inside it was colder than the air suggested. Not cold in temperature but in presence. The kind of stillness that whispered of power and secrets, of lives that had once burned bright but now flickered in silence. Amani Brooks stepped through the east corridor, her black shoes silent against the thick Persian rugs that blanketed the hall. She carried a fresh set of bed linens in one arm, her other hand resting against the polished wood of the paneling to steady herself. Every detail of the Howbridge estate was immaculate. The floors gleamed, the chandeliers sparkled even on overcast days, and the furniture stood like sentinels untouched by time. But beneath all that perfection, something felt unbreathable. She paused at the door to Mr. Julian Howbridge's suite, her breath catching just slightly before she knocked once, then entered. The room smelled of lavender and antiseptic. A fire flickered low in the hearth, not for ambiance but necessity. The man she'd been assigned to tend sat facing the window in a high-backed wheelchair, his silhouette outlined by weak sunlight. Once the lion of Howbridge Industries, Julian Howbridge had built empires with his voice alone. Now that same voice barely rose above a whisper. Amani moved with practiced care, placing the linens on the end of the bed. Her uniform was crisp, every fold in place, hair pulled back tight to the nape of her neck. She did not speak unless spoken to. That was part of the job. No chatter, no questions. But she watched. And lately, what she saw unsettled her. Julian's frame had become alarmingly frail. His fingers trembled when he reached for the teacup the butler left each morning. His skin had taken on a faint bluish pallor around the lips, and sometimes when he shifted in his chair, a quiet grunt slipped past his lips. The others dismissed it. Post-surgical fatigue, the doctor said, natural at his age. The chef called it old man's fussiness, and the butler simply smoothed Julian's robe and kept the guests entertained with stories of his recovery. But Amani had seen stitches before. She had sat beside a hospital bed more times than she liked to remember, holding her little brother's hand as machines beeped steadily around him. She knew what healing looked like, and what didn't. Today, as she pulled back the heavy comforter and peeled away the old sheets, her eyes caught something unusual. Mr. Howbridge shifted slightly in his chair, one hand reaching to adjust the thick collar of his cashmere robe. As the fabric shifted, she saw it, just for a second, a stain the size of a quarter near the upper chest, barely visible against the soft brown material. A dark, muted red. It wasn't bright or sudden, it was slow, dried at the edges. Amani froze, her eyes narrowing. She didn't speak immediately. She adjusted the pillows first, making sure he was comfortable. Then her voice low but steady, she said, "Sir, I think your robe has a stain." Julian turned his head slightly, the weight of it seeming too heavy for his neck. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, were pale now, rimmed with red. "Oh," he said, glancing down with mild disinterest. "That? Just some dried blood. Old stitches, they warned me it might happen, nothing to worry about." He waved one hand dismissively, already turning back toward the window. The conversation was, in his mind, over. But Amani didn't move. She stared at the faint mark, her stomach curling in unease. "It's deeper than that," she wanted to say. "You're not healing, you're bleeding." But her mouth remained closed. Instead she finished changing the sheets, her fingers trembling only slightly as she tucked in the corners. She folded the used linens and stepped quietly out of the room. That night, in the cramped servants' quarters down the hall, she lay flat on the stiff mattress and stared at the cracked ceiling above her. Rain tapped against the window pane. The house creaked as it settled. Somewhere down the hall, the cook laughed at the radio. But in her mind, Amani replayed the image of that red stain over and over again. The way Mr. Howbridge's hand had trembled. The shallow rise and fall of his chest. Something wasn't right. She turned onto her side and pulled the blanket closer, but the cold wasn't in the air, it was inside her. A quiet gnawing dread. It whispered that maybe no one else saw what she saw, that maybe no one else cared to. After all, he was just another old wealthy man with a private doctor, an estate staff, and enough money to paper over mistakes. But she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone around him had mistaken silence for stability, and that she might be the only one left who hadn't. In the morning she would return to that room. She would bring his tea and fluff his pillows. She would pretend, as everyone else did, that nothing was amiss. But tonight, as thunder rolled low across the sky and the old house groaned beneath its history, Amani Brooks made herself a quiet promise. She would watch closer. She would not let that red stain grow, without knowing exactly what it meant. The night passed slowly inside the narrow quarters where Amani Brooks lay curled on a mattress too thin for comfort, beneath a blanket too rough to soothe. The ceiling above her head bore long yellowed cracks like tired branches reaching toward nowhere. Rain tapped steadily against the old window frame, not loud, not violent, just persistent, like the thoughts tumbling in her mind. She pulled the blanket tighter around her chest and stared upward, her eyes wide open in the darkness. She had seen it again, clearly, undeniably. That stain, deepening against the brown robe like a silent warning. She hadn't imagined it. It wasn't a trick of the light or a coincidence. No one else in that entire estate had noticed, or maybe they had and chose not to speak. But she had noticed. And once you saw something like that, once it nested inside your thoughts, it refused to let go. Amani turned onto her side and stared at the pale blue wall inches from her face. Her mind drifted to a different room. Years earlier, back in a hospital far from this grand estate, her little brother Marcus had been 13 when he'd undergone heart valve surgery. The doctor had called it routine, had smiled with that same confident indifference Julian's physician seemed to wear. But 3 days into recovery, something had gone wrong. Marcus had complained of pain, deeper than before. A strange spot had appeared just above the bandage. The nurses had waved it off. Healing takes time, they'd said. Bruising is normal. But Amani had seen the way his breath came shorter, the way his eyes darted nervously when no one was looking. She remembered standing in that hospital hallway, feeling invisible as adults in lab coats walked past. No one listened to the scared teenage girl holding her brother's hand, until his fever spiked and his chest swelled, and then suddenly it was a flurry of codes and wires and shouting. He'd lived, barely. She would never forget the weight of that moment. The cold knowledge that if she had spoken louder, sooner, insisted harder, maybe it wouldn't have gotten so bad. Now, lying in a stranger's house wrapped in wealth and old pride, that same pressure squeezed her chest. "I'm just the maid," she whispered into the dark. The words felt small, ridiculous. "It's not my place." But another voice inside her, stronger, rooted deeper, rose up to meet it. "And if no one else sees it, if you don't speak, who will?" The rain continued outside, soft and steady. Amani didn't sleep. By morning the clouds had lifted, and light filtered through the lace curtains in her room with a dull gray softness. She smoothed her uniform, tightened her hair, and carried the breakfast tray up the main staircase without a word to anyone. The estate had begun to stir. Footsteps echoed distantly in the halls, the smell of baked bread crept from the kitchen, and somewhere down the west wing, a door creaked open and shut. She reached Mr. Halbridge's suite and knocked twice before entering. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers. Julian sat slouched in his wheelchair, facing the window again, wrapped in the same brown robe, though this morning it hung looser on his frame. A cup of tea rested untouched on the table beside him. His breath came slow and shallow. Amani stepped inside and placed the tray down with care. The silverware clinked quietly against porcelain. Julian didn't turn. "I brought breakfast, sir," she said softly. He murmured. "Thank you, Amani." She paused, then took a breath. "Sir, may I ask about the stain I saw yesterday? On your robe?" Julian exhaled through his nose, tired. "Ah, that." Still worrying about a drop of blood. Amani stepped closer, keeping her voice measured but firm. "It's not just a drop, sir. I believe it's gotten larger." He chuckled dryly, the sound brittle. "Everyone's become a doctor these days." "I'm not a doctor," she said carefully. "But I've seen this before. My brother had a surgery once. The wound looked like that just before. She stopped herself. The words had nearly escaped too fast. Julian turned slightly toward her, his eyes narrowed, not angry, but searching. I appreciate your concern, he said, quieter now. But the doctors say it's fine. Healing takes time. With respect, sir, she interrupted, and immediately felt her heart thump in her chest. This wasn't something you did, not to someone like him. But she couldn't stop. Healing doesn't spread blood across your chest. It doesn't make you weaker every day. Julian studied her, his mouth pressed into a tight line. The fire popped behind them. You're persistent, he said finally. I suppose that's why Mrs. Halbridge hired you. I suppose so, she replied, forcing a breath through her nose. For a moment, neither spoke. A thin silence stretched between them, full of something heavier than words. Then, without warning, Julian leaned forward with a sudden strained cough that tore through the quiet. The sound was sharp, jagged, so unlike the weak murmurs she'd grown used to hearing. He reached one trembling hand toward his chest, just above the collarbone, his fingers splayed over the robe. His body jerked once in the chair, and then slumped forward slightly, as though the weight had become too much to hold. Sir. Amani rushed to his side, her breath catching. Julian coughed again, this time wetter. She reached for his shoulder and gently straightened him, and that's when she saw it. The robe had parted slightly during the movement, and beneath the fold, the dark stain had grown, blooming outward across the fabric like spilled ink. Not old blood, fresh, and worse, it had seeped through in a new pattern, uneven, pulsing at the edges. Amani's hands shook as she hovered near the wound. The smell of iron, faint but distinct, reached her nose. Julian looked up at her with effort, his eyes clouded. It's nothing, he whispered. But it wasn't nothing. She could see it now. His lips had paled, his breath uneven, his posture failing him with every second. No, she said, louder than before, this isn't healing. It's getting worse. He blinked, and something flickered in his gaze, not defiance, not stubbornness, fear, and in that moment, Amani knew she could no longer wait. Whatever line she wasn't supposed to cross had already vanished behind her. She reached for the small phone on the side table, her fingers moving fast, her pulse louder than the crackle of the fire behind them. She didn't care anymore about place or permission. She had waited once before, and nearly lost someone she loved. She would not do it again. Amani reached for the phone with one hand while her other pressed the folded napkin against Julian's chest. The fabric, thick and white just minutes ago, was now turning a dark, sickening red. She felt the warmth seeping through it, slow at first but growing heavier with each breath he struggled to take. The cordless receiver was slick in her grip as she punched the emergency extension. Her voice shook, but her words came fast. This is Amani Brooks in Mr. Halbridge's suite. He's bleeding from his surgical site. I need medical assistance immediately. The operator's voice, calm and rehearsed, came through the line like an anchor thrown in the wrong direction. Yes, ma'am. Can you confirm the extent of the bleeding? We'll need to initiate a... There's no time, Amani snapped, her voice suddenly sharp. The blood is soaking through. He's turning pale. You need to send someone now. But I need to log the... Amani's patience cracked under the weight of urgency. Send them, now, he's fading. She didn't wait for acknowledgement. She hung up the phone with a forceful click and turned her attention back to Julian. His breathing had grown uneven, his chest rising in short, shallow bursts. His head drooped slightly to the left, and his fingers twitched weakly on the armrest. She adjusted the napkin, applying firmer pressure, and leaned closer. Stay with me, she whispered. You're not alone, I see you. The room felt colder now, despite the fire still glowing in the hearth. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the creeping dread slithering up her spine, the knowledge that everything could collapse in the next few minutes. The door swung open abruptly, slamming against the paneled wall with a loud crack. The butler, Mr. Cummings, stepped in, his expression tight and disapproving. He took in the scene, the blood, the napkin in her hand. Julian slumped in the chair and his eyes narrowed. What is the meaning of this? He demanded, his voice stiff with authority. Miss Brooks, what exactly do you think you're doing? Amani didn't even glance up. I called the medical team. He's hemorrhaging. You called them. His tone rose with incredulity. Without clearance. You've caused panic. This could be a false alarm. It's not, she snapped, turning to face him fully now. Her face was pale, but her voice held steel. Look at him. Do you see the color of his skin? The way his breathing sounds? This isn't a scare. This is real. Cummings moved forward, his jaw clenched. You've stepped out of line. We have a procedure. You are not qualified. If he dies, she cut in, her eyes burning. Will you write that on the procedure too? That we waited, that we hesitated while he bled through his robe. Cummings faltered. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Amani turned back to Julian. The napkin was soaked now, too wet to hold shape. She grabbed another from the tray and pressed it over the first, her fingers trembling. Sir, she said, more gently this time. Can you hear me? Julian's head bobbed faintly, his eyes half-lidded and glassy. He murmured something she couldn't catch, just the faint motion of lips and a whisper of breath. Then his body slackened slightly, his chin falling toward his chest. His fingers slid from the armrest. No, she whispered, reaching to steady him. Stay with me, please. The door burst open again, this time with urgency that rattled the windows. Dr. Callahan entered, a leather medical bag slung over one shoulder. The nurse behind him wheeled a tray of supplies, already snapping on gloves. Callahan's gaze landed on Julian, then dropped to the spreading stain over his chest. He went pale. Damn it, he muttered, rushing forward and kneeling beside the chair. He's bleeding internally. This is a rupture. He snapped his fingers at the nurse. Get the kit open now. Oxygen on standby. We're prepping for immediate transfer. Amani stepped back, heart pounding, her hands sticky with blood. Her uniform, spotless as always, now bore dark blotches down the front. But she didn't move further. She couldn't. Her feet felt rooted to the carpet. The moment stretched, everything happening both too fast and too slow. Callahan pulled back the robe and cursed under his breath. Sutures failed, possibly the artery beneath. If we hadn't come when we did. He didn't finish the sentence. The nurse handed him a temporary pressure bandage. He pressed it over the wound and turned to the radio clipped to his belt. This is Callahan. We need transport to Boston General. Priority 1. Patient is in critical condition. Vitals are unstable. ETA to readiness, 5 minutes. Notify the ER. The security guard appeared in the doorway seconds later with a stretcher. They moved with precision, lifting Julian gently but quickly, stabilizing him with straps and monitors. Amani stood motionless, her hands still curled at her sides, her chest rising and falling in tight, shallow breaths. Julian was barely conscious now. His eyes fluttered open for the briefest moment and caught hers. She didn't speak, she couldn't. He blinked slowly, then his lips moved once more. A whisper, nothing more than air. Thank you. Then he closed his eyes. They wheeled him out, the nurse holding an IV bag above her head, Callahan shouting vitals as they turned the corner. The hallway echoed with the sound of hurried footsteps and the low whine of the stretcher wheels against the wooden floor. Amani remained by the chair, staring down at the napkins stained with his blood, one still clutched in her right hand. Her fingers were numb, her knees weak, but she didn't cry. Not yet. Behind her, the fire hissed quietly, devouring the last of the wood. Cummings lingered in the doorway, his face stricken, but said nothing. For the first time, there was no reprimand, no protocol, just silence. And in that silence, Amani understood something deeper than fear or grief. She had done the right thing. Even if she hadn't been allowed, even if no one had thanked her, she had seen a man in danger, and she had acted. As she walked slowly toward the window, she watched the flashing lights of the ambulance fade through the estate's long drive. The rain had stopped, the sky was clearing, but the air still smelled like thunder. The antiseptic sting of hospital air clung to Amani's skin the moment she stepped through the double doors of Boston General. Everything about the lobby felt too bright, white floors polished to an artificial shine, fluorescent lights humming overhead, machines beeping in perfect emotionless rhythm somewhere beyond the walls. A nurse at the front desk looked up with tired eyes as Amani gave her name. She was ushered through a maze of quiet halls, past closed doors, some hiding silence, others hiding struggle. She walked with careful, deliberate steps, still wearing her uniform from the Howbridge estate. The stains had been scrubbed from the fabric, but she could still feel the dried texture of blood on her fingertips. In her chest a heavy pressure refused to lift. She didn't know what she expected, maybe a grim face, a solemn handshake, or even the polite dismissal she'd grown too used to receiving. But when the door to room 204 opened, she paused in the threshold and felt the air shift. Julian Halbridge was alive. He sat propped up in a reclining hospital bed, dressed in a fresh gown, a faint flush of color returned to his cheeks. A heart monitor beside him beat with slow steadiness, the line rising and falling like breath itself. His head turned when he saw her, and something softened in his face, not the distant gaze of a man used to being served, but the quiet recognition of someone who had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in a long while. "I was hoping you'd come," Julian said, his voice still thin but steadier than she remembered. His hand, frail but firm, reached out across the crisp white blanket. Imani stepped forward, hesitated, and then took it gently in hers. "You shouldn't be sitting up," she said softly, her throat tight. "I shouldn't be breathing," he replied with a weak smile. "But here I am, and that's because of you." Her heart lurched, caught between relief and disbelief. She sat down in the chair beside his bed, still holding his hand. The room was quiet, except for the hum of machines and the occasional click of footsteps down the corridor outside. Julian's eyes, once fogged by exhaustion, were sharp again, though dulled at the edges by pain. "They told me what happened," he said, not taking his eyes from hers. Dr. Callahan explained everything. As if summoned by name, the doctor appeared in the doorway. Callahan stepped in slowly, nodding once at Imani. His white coat was unbuttoned, sleeves rolled up to the elbow, and for the first time, the man looked less like a fortress of authority and more like someone carrying a weight he hadn't prepared for. "I owe you an apology," Callahan said plainly, walking toward the bed. "Both of you." Imani looked up, her fingers still laced with Julian's. "You don't need to." "Yes, I do." He stopped at the foot of the bed, and met her gaze. The rupture was in a secondary artery, a small branch near the original incision. "The sutures we used weren't holding. It's rare, but it happens. Had it gone unnoticed for another 6 to 12 hours, the bleeding would have been irreversible." Julian's brow furrowed. "So it wasn't just weakness or recovery fatigue." Callahan shook his head slowly. "It was internal hemorrhaging, silent and deadly. Miss Brooks is the only reason we caught it in time." Imani's eyes dropped to her lap, unsure how to carry the weight of that truth. She hadn't acted to be thanked or recognized. She had simply seen something no one else had dared to see. Julian squeezed her hand gently. "You saw me, Imani. Not just the blood or the weakness. You saw me. No one's done that in a long time." She looked at him then, her eyes rimmed with tears she hadn't allowed earlier. "I just did what anyone should have done." "No," Julian said, shaking his head, "not anyone. Everyone else looked past it. You looked through it, and you didn't flinch." Callahan cleared his throat, offering one final nod before turning to leave. "I'll give you both some privacy. He's stable now, but he needs rest, and time." Imani rose to let the doctor pass, then sank back into the chair. She stared out the window for a moment. The sky had cleared since she'd arrived, sunlight pouring down on the city's old brick buildings and glinting off the tops of parked cars below. The world kept turning, indifferent and unstoppable. Julian shifted slightly in bed, and reached for the drawer built into the side table. His movements were slow, labored but deliberate. He pulled out a manila folder, thick and worn at the edges, and extended it toward her. Imani frowned, confused, and accepted it with both hands. "Open it," he said. She slid a single document halfway out, then stopped. The first thing she saw was a deed, then a map, then a photo of a small house nestled near a quiet lake, surrounded by trees, the kind that changed color in autumn and held silence in winter. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out the rest. "It's in Vermont," Julian said, watching her reaction. "It used to be my wife's favorite place. After she passed, I stopped going. I kept it quiet, off the books, but it's peaceful, honest, somewhere you could breathe." Imani's voice caught in her throat. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because it's yours." She stared at him, stunned. "What?" "You've spent your life answering to others," he said, "doing what's expected, staying invisible, playing small when you are anything but. You deserve a place that isn't someone else's, a place where you're not just allowed to speak, you're expected to." Imani looked down at the folder, then back at him. I can't accept this, it's too much. It's not a gift, he said. It's recognition, and it's long overdue. Tears welled up in her eyes, unblinking. She shook her head, not in refusal but in disbelief. No one had ever handed her something like this, not out of pity, not out of charity, but out of respect. Earned, real. She whispered, "You don't have to do this." "I do," Julian replied, "because I wouldn't be here if you hadn't stood up when everyone else stayed silent. You reminded me I was still a man worth saving." The monitor beside him beeped steadily, filling the quiet between them. Outside, a wind moved through the trees. The sunlight spilled across the floor, catching the edges of the folder in her hands. And for the first time in a very long time, Imani Brooks did not feel small. For days after the hospital, Imani carried the deed around like something fragile, like a snowflake balanced on her palm, real but impossible, beautiful but temporary. She had tucked it inside her coat pocket, then her drawer, then back into her coat again, as if proximity might help her understand it better. Every time she looked at the photo of the house in Vermont, weathered shingles, white porch, a quiet lake framed by golden trees, it felt less like a gift, and more like a question she wasn't ready to answer. Julian had been persistent, though not in the commanding way she had once imagined men like him would be. He did not threaten, or demand, or manipulate. He simply looked at her with the kind of certainty that rattled whatever was left of her hesitation. He said he had made up his mind, and this time, she could not find the strength or the reason to argue. In the days that followed, he returned home from the hospital, thinner and slower than before, but unmistakably alive. The halls of Halbridge Estate, once filled only with echoes and formality, now carried the sound of human breath and shared laughter. Julian's recovery became the heartbeat of the house, and though the doctors and nurses came and went, there was only one person he asked for by name every morning. Imani, not Miss Brooks, not the maid, Imani. He had called her into the drawing room one morning, sunlight cutting through the stained glass window and scattering colors across the polished floor. He was sitting comfortably in his chair now, a soft blanket across his knees and a glint in his eye that hadn't been there in months. "I've spoken to the staff," he said, folding his hands over his lap. "You are no longer a domestic employee in this house. I want you as my personal care advisor, full-time. Formal title, compensation equal to a medical assistant's rate, benefits, autonomy." She had blinked at him, stunned. "You don't need to do that. I was just..." "No," he interrupted gently. "You weren't just anything. You saved my life. You didn't hesitate when everyone else did. That is a kind of intelligence that doesn't come from textbooks. I want you by my side, not because I owe you, but because I trust you." And so for the first time in her life, Imani Brooks accepted a role not beneath someone, but beside them. Not in shadows, but in daylight. 2 weeks later, on a cool October afternoon, the garden behind the Halbridge estate stirred with soft music, murmured conversation, and the gentle clinking of glasses. The ivy along the old brick walls had turned amber and deep red. Strings of lights floated above the gathering, and the long table under the gazebo had been set with care. It was a modest event, by estate standards, no press, no grandeur, just those who mattered. Julian had insisted on standing, despite the doctor's warnings, leaning slightly on a polished cane but determined. His voice, when it rose above the hum of the crowd, still carried the presence of the man who once commanded boardrooms. "Thank you all for coming," he began, lifting his glass slightly. "I won't bore you with the details of my medical adventure, though it involved far too many needles and far too little dessert, but I will say this: there was a moment not long ago, when I nearly did not come home. A moment when the silence in my chest almost became permanent." He turned slowly to his right, where Imani stood, dressed simply but elegantly, her hair gathered back, her hands loosely clasped in front of her. Her eyes glistened but held steady, and in that moment, Julian continued, when everyone else dismissed the warning signs, one person refused to look away. One person saw me, not the old man, not the patient, not the powerful name, but the human being. Imani Brooks. A soft ripple moved through the guests as heads turned, surprised and impressed. Julian reached for her hand and held it up gently. "This woman saved my life, and from this day forward, she is not only a part of this estate, She is part of my family. Applause rose slowly but sincerely, echoing between the hedges and the ancient stone fountain. Imani stood there, not needing to speak, because everything had already been said. That night, long after the last guest had left, after the table had been cleared and the stars had taken their place across the sky, Imani stood alone in the guest suite. She no longer cleaned but now inhabited. She packed a small overnight bag and placed the Vermont deed on top, smoothing it with one hand. The next morning, she drove north. The road unwound before her like ribbon, narrow and lined with trees losing their leaves in slow golden showers. It was a crisp day, cool enough for a scarf, bright enough for hope. When she pulled into the gravel driveway of the lakeside house, the wind stirred the surface of the water in gentle waves. A few ducks bobbed near the reeds, unbothered by her presence. She unlocked the front door with a soft click and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust, but it welcomed her like it had been waiting. The wooden floors creaked under her boots. There were 2 chairs by the window facing the lake, and she sat down in one, folding her hands in her lap. Outside, the leaves fell in slow spirals. A loon called in the distance. The water reflected the sky like a mirror no one had cracked yet. Imani Brooks, once invisible, once unheard, once taught to step back and stay silent, now watched the world unfold from a place that belonged entirely to her. She had made a choice, not to be loud, not to fight for recognition, but to speak when it mattered, to act when it counted. And that had made all the difference. As she sat by the window, the light warming her cheek, she closed her eyes for just a moment and let the silence in. This time, it didn't feel empty. It felt like home.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.